Welcome back, BioMonsters. Today we're going to be talking about pedigrees. So let's go ahead and dive in. The first thing that we need to do is talk about what a pedigree actually looks like. And the best analogy for describing a pedigree is to say that it's like a family tree. The only difference is in a family tree you see faces and you see names. So it's like a family tree without names or faces. But a pedigree works just like a family tree. It shows you connections between different individuals, and it also shows you multiple generations and how those generations are connected to previous generations. Now, in order to understand a pedigree, you actually have to know a little bit about a key. So on a pedigree, you're basically going to be looking at one of two shapes, or a combination of both. So if you see a square always represents a male, and a circle always represents a female. So again, you're not going to see any family names, and you're not going to see any faces, so this is the only way to differentiate between males and females on the pedigree. You'll also see lines that look like this, so you'll have horizontal lines. These horizontal lines represent mating events or fertilization events. So it means that these two individuals have had or will have offspring. Anytime you see a line that looks like this, so it's a vertical line, this represents the next generation. Specifically, it shows us the children. So it's the connection from parent to the children. The next thing that you need to know is that sometimes these shapes are filled in. So if you see a shape that looks like this, or if you see a shape that looks like this and they're filled in or blacked out, that blacked out shape actually denotes something. So if you see two shapes that are filled in, it means that these shapes are representative of an individual who is affected. And what I mean by affected is that it means that they have the phenotype that we're looking to study from one generation to the next. If, however, you see shapes that are left wide open, like the shapes we initially had, these two shapes denote either one of two things. It either denotes an individual that is unaffected, or it could represent an individual that is a carrier, or who is someone who is heterozygous. So you'll have to be able to figure out whether it's an unaffected individual or a carrier by looking at how things move from one generation to the next. Sometimes, however, you'll get lucky, and if you get lucky, you'll see shapes that look like this, that are partially shaded in. Now, anytime you see a pedigree that have shapes partially shaded in, that's kind of like having a cheat sheet. So anytime it's partially shaded in like this, it means that the individual is a carrier or that it's heterozygous. So this way you don't actually have to do any legwork to figure out any of that information. So let's actually see a real pedigree and put this information into play. So here's an actual pedigree, and notice if we're looking at this pedigree, we have circles and we have squares, and let's go ahead and fill in what this means just so we don't get confused. Anytime you see a circle, again, this represents a female, and anytime you see a square, it represents a male. And the same thing holds true for whether it's filled in or not filled in. So if it's filled in, again, it means that they are affected. It means that they have the phenotype that we're studying. And if they're not filled in, it can mean one of two things again. It can mean that they are unaffected, or it can mean that they are a carrier, which also means that they're heterozygous, and you'd have to study the pedigree in order to differentiate these two things. Our pedigree also has the number of generations over here on the left-hand side, and sometimes they're denoted and sometimes they're not, but you'd have to be able to figure out how many generations there are based on your horizontal and vertical lines. So again, here are horizontal lines, and this is just showing us that a fertilization event happened here. And this vertical line means that they had children. And this vertical line also denotes the next generation. So from individuals 1 through 7, these are all the offspring of individuals 1 and 2 from generation number 1. We can continue to look on and note that individuals 7 and 8 in generation 2 had a fertilization event, and they also had children that gives rise to the third generation, and they had, according to our pedigree, 4 children. They had 3 males and 1 female. And again, individual number 10 in generation 3 had another mating event with individual 11, giving rise to the 4th generation, and they had 2 children. And so a pedigree just shows us individuals that have had mating events and their children from one generation to the next, but it also allows us to trace a particular phenotype from one generation to the next as well. Pedigrees can tell us a number of different things. The first thing a pedigree can tell us or show us is the transmission of a phenotype from one generation to the next. So we can simply watch it from generation 1 to generation 2 to 3 to 4 and so on. A pedigree can also tell us whether or not the transmission is autosomal. So if it's an autosomal inheritance pattern, or it can tell us that it is a sex-linked inheritance pattern. Now let's talk about these two patterns really quickly because those words can be kind of confusing. So if we're talking about an autosomal inheritance pattern, we're talking about the transmission of a phenotype that is linked to a gene found on the first 22 chromosomes. So an autosomal inheritance pattern could be simple Mendelian genetics, it could be incomplete dominance, codominance, multiple alleles, or it could be polygenic inheritance. The sex-linked inheritance pattern means that it has to do with the last chromosome pair. And let's talk about what that last chromosome pair actually controls. Remember, the last chromosome pair controls the sex. And if something is sex-linked, you'll see more males than females with the phenotype. So it's an easy way. All you would do is count. If you have 6 males and only 1 female, it should automatically tell you that we're dealing with a sex-linked inheritance pattern and not an autosomal inheritance pattern. The last thing that a pedigree can show us or tell us is it can tell us whether we're dealing with a dominant phenotype or a recessive phenotype. And we'll talk really quickly about how that the pedigree can actually show you that. Remember that when Mendel was working with his pea plants, whenever he was dealing with a recessive phenotype, let's say height, a short pea plant is recessive, sometimes when he would cross them, that recessive allele would disappear. So you wouldn't actually see it in the expression or the phenotype of that individual. So it would actually be present in one generation, disappear in the next generation, and then reappear again. So we know that something is a recessive phenotype in a pedigree if it can disappear and then reappear. It'll be a dominant phenotype if you see it in every generation. So let's go ahead and apply this information. So here, looking at this pedigree, we have a pedigree that represents 4 different generations. And in our pedigree, we have our males and females again, so I'm going to go ahead and label them. This circle is a female, and this square is a male. And again, we have a horizontal line showing us a fertilization event, our vertical line showing us the children that came out of that particular event. So I have my children here, and if I look, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 children that descended from these first 2 individuals here. And then I have another mating event here in the second generation. We have a total of 2 mating events giving rise to another set of children. And then within our third generation, we have 2 more mating events giving rise to another set of children that make up our 4th generation. So the first thing that I want to ask myself is, do we see anything unusual? And the first thing that I notice is that I have a disproportionate number of males to females that have this particular phenotype. In fact, I only have affected males. So I don't have any females with this particular phenotype. So that immediately tells me something. It tells me that we're definitely dealing with a sex-linked trait. And the reason why I know it's sex-linked is because we only have males with this particular phenotype, which we've talked about before. Another thing that I notice that's interesting is if I look at this particular trait from one generation to the next, I notice that it disappears, appears again, and then disappears again. So that also tells me something else. It tells me that we're dealing with a recessive trait. It appears and then it disappears. Here is another pedigree. This pedigree doesn't have our generations listed, so I'm going to go ahead and write it out. Here's generation 1, generation 2, and generation 3. Again, I have my males, which are squares, and my females that are circles. And if I'm looking at this particular pedigree, I notice that we're not seeing anything disappear from one generation to the next. So I'm going to go ahead and write that this represents a dominant trait. So we're looking at something that's dominant. Another thing that I notice is that I have roughly the same number of male and females with this particular trait. So right away that I know that it can't be sex-linked. So instead, I know that this is an autosomal trait or an autosomal inheritance pattern. So if you need any more help working with pedigrees, feel free to stop by and see me. I have lots of practice pedigrees that you can work with. But again, remember the 3 things that you're trying to determine by looking at a pedigree, and make sure you pay attention to your keys.